Good afternoon. The committee will come to order. I understand the ranking member will be here in just a moment, but rather than keep everyone waiting, I'll go ahead and give my opening statement. We do want to welcome everyone here and our colleagues who will be joining us shortly, as well as our distinguished witnesses to the Subcommittee on Asia and Pacific hearing this afternoon. There's no doubt that today the Cambodian people are better off than they were in the late 70s under the Khmer Rouge, when as many as 2 million Cambodians were murdered. But while the region has significantly changed since the days of the Cold War, Cambodia has taken very few steps to open its political system and move toward a more transparent and responsive regime. The past 30 years have shown that Cambodia's dictator, Prime Minister Hun Sen, has not and will not tolerate real political debate. And the upcoming national elections have only underscored the deterioration of the human rights landscape in Cambodia over the course of the past few years. On October 23, 1991, 19 countries joined together to sign the Paris Peace Agreement, which offered a political settlement aimed at ending the tragic conflict and continuing bloodshed in Cambodia. It also laid out the process for building a just and democratic Cambodia anchored in human rights and the rule of law. The United Nations maintained a mission in the country until 1993 to supervise the ceasefire, prepare Cambodia for its new constitution, and help ensure that its first general elections were free and fair. It was this agreement that planted the seeds for an environment in which the respect for human rights could be protected and could grow. 20 years have passed since Cambodia held its first national elections, but the vision for the Cambodian people that the international community put in writing is not yet a reality. Cambodia remains consumed by a corrupt political system that is becoming more authoritarian with each passing day. Hun Sen and the ruling Cambodian People's Party do not foster democratic discourse or respect the fundamental freedoms that will allow the Cambodian people to live more prosperous and fulfilling lives. Despite the large amount of foreign aid the U.S. and international community has provided to the Cambodian government and its people for the purposes of promoting human rights, civil and political liberties, improving educational standards, combating health risks, and increasing food security, Hun Sen is taking every action to make it nearly impossible for this aid to be effectively used in a political and social structure that is mired in corruption. On July 28th, Cambodia will hold its 5th election behind a false veil of democracy, during which Hun Sen will win his 4th term as Prime Minister through the incitement of political violence, corruption, and nepotism. This victory will only ensure a political, social, and economic future for the Cambodian people that is both uncertain and dire. The list of intimidating and repressive actions taken by the CPP is long. Last month, they expelled 27 elected opposition legislators from the National Assembly and attempted to prohibit radio stations from broadcasting all Khmer language foreign news. It also refuses to allow opposition leader Sam Rainsy from running in the upcoming election, has made death threats to human rights activists and organizations, and inhibits other opposition party members from running effective campaigns. In addition to severely restricting freedom of speech and association, Hun Sen has warned the Cambodian people that if they do not re-elect him, civil war will return. I commend the international community for its decision to not send election monitors to Cambodia and legitimize Hun Sen's illegitimate victory, but declaring the election not free or fair is not enough. U.S. policy toward Cambodia needs to change, and the Obama administration needs to take a much tougher approach to Asia's longest ruling dictator. I intend to introduce legislation which complements a bill Senators Graham and Rubio introduced last month, urging the State Department and USAID to not support the national elections if the UN recommendations made in July 2012 by the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia are ignored, and political opposition parties and leaders are excluded from the election. So far, neither has happened. The legislation also calls for the U.S. to withhold foreign assistance to the Cambodian government if the elections are not judged credible and competitive. Cutting off direct aid to the Cambodian government, specifically foreign military financing and international military education and training funding, is a tangible action the U.S. can take to show its condemnation of the upcoming fallacious and undemocratic election. I also urge Secretary Kerry to issue a condemnation of the elections. A department press release is not enough and will only highlight the administration's indifference toward Hun Sen's actions and the human rights of the Cambodian people. Today, the real question is how much leverage does the U.S. still have in Cambodia and with Hun Sen? And how can the U.S. leverage its assistance to better address the growing human rights abuses in Cambodia at a time of incredible political instability? We have seen Cambodia's political and economic ties with China significantly grow, which has impacted the effectiveness of U.S. assistance to advance the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. Chinese loans, infrastructure development, investment, and aid has grown alongside Cambodia's resistance to address these abuses, which calls into serious question the administration's decision to increase military financing to Cambodia and our overall aid strategy. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this afternoon regarding all the issues that I've just mentioned. And I now yield to my good friend from the American Samoa, the Ranking Member, Mr. Feli Vega, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also would like to offer my personal welcome to our distinguished witnesses here this afternoon. Mr. Chairman, lately our country seems to be on a mission to stir up discord here, there, and everywhere in parts of the world where we could use our allies and partners. It's my hope that in the case of Cambodia, we will proceed more cautiously. When I served as chairman of this subcommittee, I held 2 hearings about Cambodia because I believe the United States needs to make right what we have done wrong in Southeast Asia. History shows that the United States failed Cambodia miserably, yet the title of today's hearing presupposes that Cambodia is to blame for not being democratic enough for our liking. In their testimony, however, I'm hopeful that our panel of esteemed human rights witnesses will advocate more for and on behalf of Cambodia in calling upon the United States, for example, to forgive Cambodia's debt. During the Lon Nol period from 1970 to 1975, Cambodia incurred a debt of about $276 million through the provision of the agricultural commodities from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. As of December 2011, with accrued interest applied to successor governments in Cambodia, the amount of debt now is over $460 million, with about $437 million in arrears. Yet Marshal Lon Nol seized power in 1970 in a military coup against Prince Sihanouk with the encouragement of the United States in order to create a buffer state for the United States forces then engaged in the war in Vietnam. Lon Nol's government, the Khmer Rouge Republic, was chaotic, dictatorial, and corrupt and depended upon large quantities of U.S. financial assistance, including the loans which created the current debt. Marshal Lon Nol's regime was overthrown on April 1, 1975, when he fled into exile, and the United States abandoned, Mr. Chairman, abandoned Cambodia and its people. The Khmer Rouge Republic was followed by the coming to power of the Khmer Rouge. Led by Pol Pot, also known as Brother Number One, the Khmer Rouge was one of the most brutal regimes of the 20th century. Responsible for the deaths of an estimated 1.7 million people out of a population of only about 7.5 million, its heartless motto was, and I quote, "To keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss." As chairman of the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee, I visited Cambodia twice. No one came away from that experience without wanting to lend a helping hand. To this day, I cannot erase from my mind the images of Tol Sling or the killing fields, where babies were torn out of wombs or beaten against trees until their skulls cracked open, where men, women, and children, families like yours and mine, were tortured, suffocated, skinned alive, and buried alive. I am sickened by the reminders of genocide, of shoes and shirts soaked in blood that are still scattered in the killing fields of Cambodia. According to His Excellency Chan Prasad, Cambodia's Minister of Commerce, whom I've had the privilege of meeting, who lost both parents to the Khmer Rouge, only 69 intellectuals survived this genocide. From ashes, Cambodia has been forced to rebuild and has looked to anyone for help. In my discussion with Minister Prasid, I was particularly struck by his words when he said to me, when you are drowning, you do not care about the color of the hand that is saving you. Sadly, history suggests that the U.S. played a role or a part in Pol Pot's rise, and these days now China, not the United States, is one of the largest sources of foreign assistance to Cambodia, lending a hand of some $800 million in aid and loans in 2006 to 2007. The United States provided a little over $100 million in the same period. While China continues to assist, even announcing that it will spend $9.6 billion building a brand new seaport in Hong Kong province and a 400-kilometer railroad connecting it to a steel mill in Prey Vinar province. And here we are pointing fingers at Cambodia. When will we realize that Cambodia is important to U.S. security interests? When will we approach the U.S.-Cambodia relations a little more responsibly? If we are serious about human rights in a country that we fail, Mr. Chairman, so miserably, we should consider these remarks from a member of the American Chamber of Commerce who recently said, and I quote, "One way of addressing the human rights issues is to promote the investment of responsible capital." I agree, this is the way forward. I commend Chevron, Dairy Queen, ConocoPhillips, Prudential, Caterpillar, and other United States firms for the role they are playing to better Cambodia's economic lifestyle. I also commend the Bush administration for lifting a 10-year ban on direct bilateral aid to Cambodia in February of 2007. And I thank U.S. State Department Special Representative for telling reporters in Phnom Penh this year in January, the pivot to Asia is not only security focused, it's an economic focus, because in order for us to be successful in the long term, we have to be economically involved in this region. I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that we get economically involved by forgiving recycling Cambodia's debt. The United States has a history of forgiving debts by countries in which there was past U.S. military involvement, including some $4.1 billion of Iraq's debt in 2004, $24 million forgiveness of Bosnia-Herzegovina's debt in 1999, $538 million of former Yugoslavia's debt in 2002. The United States also has a long history in Asia of using incurred debt to fund U.S. assistance programs. We forgave Jordan some $500 million of their debt. So it's my sincere hope, Mr. Chairman, that our human rights activists will speak more for recycling or forgiving Cambodia's debt, as I believe this course of action will lead to the outcome for a better results in the economic needs of the people of Cambodia. I welcome our witnesses, especially Mr. Dan Mitchell, who traveled all the way from Cambodia as member of the American Chamber of Commerce, so that he could share with us his perspective about how important it is in having an economic relationship with Cambodia. It seems to me that when you talk about human rights, these people have got to be fed. Human rights violations, according to the Chinese outlook about human rights. I remember President Zemin, when we visited him in Beijing, and said, "Oh, it's very fine you're talking about human rights. You know what human rights is to us? If I don't put food on the table of that family, I have violated their human rights." That's the essence in terms of somewhat of a different interpretation what human rights mean to some people in other parts of the world. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I've taken too much of your precious time, but I do thank you for the extra minutes that you've given me. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fairling-Vega. And we'll now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, for a purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a brief statement. With the national quota elections in Cambodia slated for the end of the month, this hearing is timely to examine our involvement in the country in terms of both foreign and military assistance and to examine the multitude of human rights concerns that have been widely reported on. And as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, much of Cambodia's budget is funded by foreign assistance from a few nations, obviously including the United States. And what have we seen in return for all of this international investment? We see a government that has been tightening their control over the country, a rule of law that is now non-existent, a human rights record that has been widely and justifiably criticized, and elections put on merely to placate the international community. So I hope that the witnesses can outline today how we can more effectively leverage the dollars we provide, and if we should be increasing our military assistance to Cambodia, like the State Department has requested in the fiscal year 2014, or if we should be considering our aid until we see progress in terms of freer elections, movement to address human rights concerns, and an increased emphasis placed on improving the rule of law. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired. I'd now like to introduce our very distinguished panel here this afternoon. I'll begin with John Sifton, who is the Asia Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch, where he works primarily on South and Southeast Asia. He previously served as the Director of One World Research, a public interest research and investigation firm. Prior to that, he spent 6 years as a researcher in the Asia Division at Human Rights Watch. Mr. Sifton has also worked for the International Rescue Committee on Afghanistan and Pakistan issues and at a refugee advocacy organization in Albania and Kosovo. He holds a law degree from New York University and a bachelor's degree from St. John's College, Annapolis, and we welcome you this afternoon. And our next witness will be Evie Schuller, who has been a legal consultant for the Cambodian League for the Protection and Defense of Human Rights in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, for over 2 years. Her primary focus is on rule of law issues and on the related harmful impact of improper land concessions on land rights. Before working for Locado, she was counsel to the Assistant Attorney General, Civil Division for the United States Department of Justice, and a litigation associate with Morrison and Forster LLP in San Francisco, and we welcome you here this afternoon, Ms. Schuller. Our next witness will be Patrick Merlo, who is a Senior Associate and Director of Electoral Programs at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs and has over 30 years of experience in promoting citizen empowerment, governmental accountability, and public policy advocacy. He oversees the Institute's programs concerning nonpartisan citizen election monitoring and advocacy for electoral integrity, political party electoral integrity activities, constitutional law reform efforts, and international election observation. Mr. Merlo has worked in more than 65 countries for NDI, focusing on conflict-sensitive states and countries that are vulnerable to authoritarian tendencies. He is a frequent public speaker and has worked with the United Nations and other governmental organizations dealing with human rights and rule of law issues. Mr. Merlo has a J.D. from the University of Pennsylvania and completed his undergraduate education at Temple University, and we welcome you here, Mr. Merlo. And our final witness here this afternoon is Daniel Mitchell, who is the CEO and Managing Director of SRP International Group, an investment and advisory firm focused on developing opportunities in Asian emerging markets. Prior to joining SRP International, Mr. Mitchell was head of strategic planning and mergers and acquisitions for Ford Motor Company's Automotive Components Division and a manager in charge of strategic planning for Mitsubishi Motors. He sits on the American Cambodian Business Council Board of Governors and is the founding member of the AmCham Corporate Social Responsibility Committee. Mr. Mitchell holds an MBA from Miami University of Ohio, very close to my district, and it's actually in Speaker Boehner's district. And my staff director graduated from that institution, as did my brother and my son. And I almost went there myself. I had a full football scholarship offer, but went somewhere else. So still a great university. So I want to again thank the panel for being here this afternoon, and we'll begin with Mr. Sifton, and the same rules will apply to all. We have a 5-minute rule. There's a lighting system. The yellow light will give you a warning that there's 1 minute to wrap up. The red light comes on. We'd appreciate you wrap up your testimony by then, if at all possible. Mr. Sifton, you'll be our first witness this afternoon.
Thank you for inviting me to testify today. Many of us in the human rights community really appreciate your attention to Cambodia, which is an all too often overlooked country, seen by many to lack geostrategic significance. Mr. Chairman, as you suggested yourself just now, Cambodia at this moment is standing on a precipice of sorts. Over 20 years after the Paris peace agreements, over 30 years since the mass crimes against humanity and genocide that occurred, the country's civil and political situation remains highly problematic. Human rights, democracy, the rule of law, things that were promised in the 1991 Paris agreements remain troublingly elusive. The problem here isn't inertia or habit. It's the result of a set of particular political facts, a particular person, in fact, and a particular party. Cambodia's ruler, Hun Sen, and his party, the Cambodian People's Party. Hun Sen and the CPP control almost every aspect of governance and civil life in Cambodia, including the military and police forces. All of Cambodia's top military and police commanders sit on the CPP's Central Committee. Hun Sen, in power since 1985, has consolidated his CPP-based rules so that he controls almost every lever of power in Cambodia, and no decision of any significance is made without his or his party's consent. One of the results of this situation is that Cambodia's supposed democratic governance is not, in fact, democratic. Now, given that Cambodia is set to hold elections less than 20 days from now, I thought it would be useful to provide a quick review of the last 4 elections to explain the context and the reality of this upcoming one. And that's what I've done in the written version of my testimony, which is submitted for the record. I note here that in the first election after the Paris agreements in 1993, Hun Sen and his party actually lost, and yet unwilling to accept the results of the elections, he threatened to go to war with the opponents to ensure his continued leadership. I also noticed the major violence in the run-up to the country's second elections in 1998, including a March 30th, 1997 grenade attack on opposition leader Sam Rainsy across the street from the National Assembly. An attack in which the FBI concluded that Hun Sen's bodyguard unit was actually implicated. And I note that in July 1997, Hun Sen carried out a coup against his co-prime minister and installed a pliant politician in his place. Do you remember this Newsweek cover from 1997? Perhaps you don't. But this is the vision of Hun Sen that we had at that time, 15 years ago. His forces, in the wake of that coup, carried out a wave of violence and summary executions that led to congressional hearings like this one here in the United States, international condemnation, and a disruption of aid to Cambodia. That was 15 years ago. A lot of blood was spilled, people were killed, and images of bodies floating down the Mekong River were carried by media services around the world. In 2003, and again in 2008, Hun Sen and the CPP again dominated the electoral process. Then, as now, they controlled the appointments, the membership of the National Election Committee, as well as the courts. That was how it was then, and that is how it is today. At this time, the leader of the opposition, Sam Rainsy, is not even able to campaign. He's been living in exile, convicted in absentia in a politically motivated case, and he's not even on the ballot as a candidate. And notably, the small slate of standing opposition candidates were, as you said, kicked out of the parliament last month for spurious and politically motivated reasons. Although Sam Rainsy recently announced that he plans to return to Cambodia in 10 days' time to campaign for his party's candidates, he's likely to be arrested and jailed upon return. The United States has already told Hun Sen and his colleagues that an election with a leader of the opposition banned from the contest and the small opposition dispersed, the legitimacy of such an election is in question. If Sam Rainsy is actually put in prison when he returns, the question is essentially answered. The election will not be a legitimate democratic exercise. What will occur on July 28th and what is occurring beforehand is an illegitimate theatrical enterprise aimed at appeasing the international community. So the main question for the United States now is not what the administration can do or demand in the next 19 days, but what the United States will say and do after the election. What will the United States do to address this, and will they again condone what amounts to fake democracy? That's the question before us now. I will end by essentially saying that Human Rights Watch believes that it's time for a stronger U.S. policy on Cambodia. There's a great deal that can be done to improve the situation there. The United States can use its empowerment of groups in Cambodia through USAID funding who serve as a check on Hun Sen's power. They can stand more visibly with dissidents and activists who seek to expose government abuses. And the United States can disassociate itself from Hun Sen. Cutting aid to military assistance, IMET, FMF, is a given at this point in our view. There are several other ideas that I'd like to run through in the question period, but we're hopeful that Secretary Kerry, as you said, will speak himself after the election and condemn the exercise and not just leave it to State Department spokespersons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sifton. Ms. Scholl, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairperson and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting the Cambodian League for the Promotion and Defense of Human Rights, LICADO, to participate in this important hearing. My testimony will summarize key points from LICADO's written statement. The past couple of years have seen a deterioration of the human rights landscape in Cambodia. Much of this trend can be linked to the significant acceleration in the issuance of long-term, large-scale land leases through 2012. As of May 2013, over 2.2 million hectares have been granted to private firms in the form of such leases, the vast majority of which have been issued in disregard of safeguards expressly provided for in the Cambodian land laws. Since 2003, over 400,000 Cambodians have been affected by land disputes. Human rights defenders, particularly those working in land rights, have been targeted for harassment, threats, unjustified criminal charges, and violence. State forces, including the military, continue to provide assistance and protection to private companies involved in land disputes with villagers, as well as taking part in forceful and occasionally lethally violent evictions. The following is a non-exhaustive list of recent violence perpetrated by members of the military. On December 12, 2011, a commanding military officer acting as a security guard for a private company shot at a group of villagers, injuring 3. The villagers had been demonstrating against the clearing of farmland by the company. On January 18, 2012, military personnel acting as security guards for TTY Company opened fire on a group of civilians who had gathered to prevent clearing of their farmland by the company's excavators. 4 villagers were injured by bullets. 4 men were eventually convicted and sentenced to a paltry 2 to 3 years, with each sentence also significantly suspended. On April 26, 2012, well-known environmental activist Chut Vuti was shot dead in a remote corner of the Cardamom Mountains while investigating illegal logging. Military police officer In Ratana was also killed by gunfire, and 2 other members of the military were present. Government officials put forward an array of bizarre and contradictory explanations for the death before finally pinning the shooting on Ratana based on an implausible scenario which was never substantiated with credible evidence. And on May 16, 2012, a large military operation saw hundreds of soldiers, military police, and police, aided by a helicopter, storm a remote village in Kratie province. Authorities claim the operation was organized to arrest 3 ringleaders in an alleged secession plot. Villagers, meanwhile, say that the attack was motivated by an ongoing land dispute with Kasatim, a firm that claims villagers are infringing on its large land concession. The operation resulted in the shooting death of a 14-year-old girl, Heng Chanta. There has been no indication of any investigation into the shooting, nor have there been any arrests. Events over the past month have also significantly undermined Cambodia's upcoming national election and are threatening its legitimacy. LICADO has investigated numerous attempts to intimidate or obstruct members and supporters of opposition parties at the commune and village levels. In the first 5 months of 2013, a total of 18 cases of politically motivated intimidation were documented. In June of this year, the National Assembly's Permanent Committee, which is comprised entirely of ruling Cambodian People's Party members, stripped all opposition party members of their parliamentary status, as noted. This left the legislative body with an unconstitutionally small membership of just 94. Regardless, the body has continued to pass politically motivated legislation and to begin consideration and debate of the country's 2014 budget. The removed parliamentarians have also been stripped of their parliamentary salaries and immunity. In late June, the government also issued 2 separate orders seeking to drastically censor the media. The more expansive of the 2 orders was revoked on June 29th, following loud public outrage. We are extremely grateful to the United States and its ambassador to Cambodia, William E. Todd, for taking an immediate and firm public position against the ban, an act which no doubt played a large role in the ban's reversal. The earlier order, however, issued on June 21st, also bans all media from broadcasting foreign reports regarding opinion polls, surveys, and election results. This ban remains in place and will take effect on July 23rd, 5 days before Election Day. In light of these and other abuses as described in our written statement, we respectfully suggest that the United States review its military aid and cooperation with the Cambodian military to take into consideration the deteriorating conditions of human rights in Cambodia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Merlot, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to address the conditions in Cambodia and leading up to the crucial July 28th elections. I'll briefly summarize my written submission to the committee and ask that it be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered. You might want to pull the mic a little bit closer, too, just make sure everybody in the room can hear.
Thank you. Since the beginning of Cambodia's 1992 transition, NDI has been involved in a series of programs that covers a range of issues with activists, political parties, and institutions in Cambodia to help create democratic governance and respect for human dignity. Though there has been progress in some areas, Cambodia's government is mired in a corrupt, semi-authoritarian political system, while Hun Sen and the ruling CPP have stunted Cambodia's democratic development, even though they receive large amounts of international aid. The international community, in our view, therefore needs to intensify support of Cambodians who are seeking and striving for democracy and human rights, while making it clear that a Cambodian government that lacks democratic legitimacy is a threat to the nation's stability and cannot be treated as a reliable partner. Otherwise, the spirit as well as the provisions of the 1991 Paris peace agreements will ring hollow. Mr. Chairman, Cambodia's electoral process, again, is not measuring well against international standards. Cambodia's National Election Committee, the NIC, is not an independent and impartial body. Recommendations put forward last year by the UN Special Rapporteur on Cambodia, as you noted, are important for ensuring democratic elections, but have largely remained unaddressed, which casts a shadow across the upcoming polls. While violence is less of a factor and concern than it has been in past Cambodian elections, the threat of violence is still a factor. Prime Minister Hun Sen's threatened civil war and return to a Khmer Rouge-like era if citizens vote for members of the opposition is an illustration of this. He has repeatedly attacked CNRP Vice President Kem Sokha, even accusing him of pedophilia and statutory rape, while among other things, Sokha faces charges of defamation for calling the CPP's campaign dirty, an ironic and illuminating fact. The CNRP President, Sam Rainsy, as you've noted, is forced into self-imposed exile in the face of politically motivated prison sentence. Nonetheless, he has recently pledged to return to Cambodia. In June, as was noted by my colleague, all CCP Parliamentary Committee voted to remove all opposition members from the National Assembly. That's the antithesis of inclusive political process and reflects on the electoral environment. All television stations are affiliated with the CPP, while the opposition's media outreach is limited to a small number of independent radio stations, and these too are under threat. Mr. Chairman, serious flaws in Cambodia's voter registry create real potentials for both illegal voting and disenfranchisement of a large number of qualified voters. In February, NDI and 2 Cambodian civil society organizations known as NICFIC and the Center for Advanced Studies conducted an impartial, systematic audit of the voter registry. That voter registry audit found that the registration rate has decreased by 5% since 2008, which contrasts starkly with the next claim that 101.7% of the eligible population is on the voter roll, a dubious statistic. While approximately 81% of the people on the roll are valid, about 18% of the names are invalid. That creates the potentials for ghost voting, that is, using the invalid names to cover for manipulated illegal voting or for underage legal voting and other impersonation. In contrast, NDI found that 10.8% of the eligible citizens who think that they're on the registry are not. That creates the potential for significant disenfranchisement. And in addition, the voter registration audit found that numerous polling stations in which more than half of the voters had been deleted from 2012. The over-deletion itself creates the possibility for significant disenfranchisement that could undermine electoral integrity. Rather than using this information from the voter registration audit and other independent sources, the government has reacted hostilely. Mr. Chairman, in the face of sustained resistance to reform by the ruling party, supporting Cambodians who are seeking democracy and human rights and a better material life is all the more important. The current political situation calls for the redoubling of such efforts going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mitchell, you'll be our final witness here this afternoon. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify at this hearing today. By way of background, I'm a native of Illinois. I've served in the Army Reserve and National Guard, to include the Ohio National Guard. I worked for several large manufacturing companies, including Ford and Mitsubishi. I founded SRP International Group and have been involved in agriculture, forestry, and manufacturing in Cambodia over the past 13 years. I'm a member of the Board of Governors of the American Chamber of Commerce in Cambodia, AmCham, and the founding member of the Corporate Social Responsibility Committee. My objective here today is neither to attack or defend the current government of Cambodia. There are human rights and corruption issues. The country's dynamic NGO and community and press regularly report and document these issues. The issues presented are serious, and some of them are acknowledged by the government. My effort here today is to provide objective information and reasoned assessments based upon my experience on the ground. I believe it is essential that the policy initiatives by the United States to deal with these challenges be informed, look to the future, and remain engaged. The AmCham has played its role through workshops over the past several years that began with U.S. FCPA compliance and have expanded to include the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. Positive government actions have included government land titling program that has issued over 3 million land titles to villagers. Additionally, management of Aklida Bank, holder of over 90% of bank loans in Cambodia, reports that 1/3 of their new loans are using these new land titles as collateral. This is progress. A lack of consistency, however, in the government's implementation of their other programs have frustrated both the foreign business community and the population at large. But tangible progress has been made. In this context, I would argue that while Prime Minister Hun Sen may be a strong man, he is not a dictator. Neither is his party monolithic. Consequently, the Prime Minister must have consensus backing for his initiatives from a variety of constituencies. Since the late 1990s, Cambodia's progress has been significant and sustained. I was fortunate enough to be a founding partner in an enterprise that was the first large-scale investment of institutional financial capital in Cambodia, in this case, European pension fund money. We were only able to reach this milestone within the requisite international legal compliance, social and environmental responsibility criteria they mandated. We demonstrated that it is possible to meet these criteria in Cambodia. As an entrepreneur, I became interested in Cambodia because of its tremendous untapped human potential. But this is also one of the country's greatest challenges. Cambodia faces major demographic issues with over 50% of its population under 25 years old and an estimated 300,000 new entrants to the workforce annually. Absorption of these new workers and increasing the overall population standard of living will require a real GDP growth of 7 to 8%. That growth requires significant capital investment. This must be socially and environmentally responsible investments and address the gaps in the skills of graduates of Cambodia's education system. The issue of youth skills and employability is of increasing significance and has greater long-term social crisis potential than the current human rights issues capturing the headlines. Economic security is the most basic of human rights. American companies and those from other developed countries can lead by example in the area of fair labor practices, environmental sustainability, and corporate social responsibility. Our behavior sets the standards in marked contrast to experience with Chinese investors who have created serious issues for local population. But in our absence, the Chinese stand ready with both investment and aid. We can be sure that human rights and corporate social responsibility are not discussion points in these negotiations. Rather than withdrawal of U.S. aid, I would advocate reallocation of portions to programs for the development of democracy. Cambodia-U.S. relations are at a crossroad. History has provided the leadership of both countries with the opportunity to work together to achieve common objectives that are of universal appeal. I look forward to your questions and further discussions. This is a summary of a longer written statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the witnesses, and we'll now ask questions here, and I'll begin with myself for 5 minutes. The subcommittee hosted an event last month to screen the award-winning documentary, Even a Bird Needs a Nest, which depicts the scourge of forced evictions in Cambodia perpetrated at the hands of the government. I reviewed the tape last night myself. Unfortunately, the people were speaking Cambodia, and it had French subtitles, and I hadn't taken French since college. I got the gist of it, but a lot of it went beyond. But Mr. Mitchell, in the past, you said that U.S. investment will help the human rights situation and difficulties over land disputes in Cambodia because it's subject to higher standards, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. As you're aware, land grabs have become an enormous problem throughout the entire country, and nearly 1 million people have been forced out of work or have no home to go to due to these forced evictions, which have not ceased despite Hun Sen's promises. One of my concerns regarding this issue is whether or not U.S. companies are involved in these land evictions. How is Cambodia implementing the standards established under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and how has your work helped set these standards in Cambodia? Also, you stated in your testimony that Chinese investments in Cambodia have made it increasingly difficult for U.S. companies to promote human rights and at the same time compete for business. How are you and the businesses you represent effectively helping the human rights situation in Cambodia and conducting responsible business despite the country's corruption and lack of rule of law? And what are you specifically doing to help stop these land grabs and help the Cambodian people? And then I'd be happy if Ms. Schuler might want to comment on the land grabs as well. So Mr. Mitchell and then Ms. Schuler.
That's a very long list of questions.
It is. And you've got like 60 seconds to answer them all.
Excellent. Forced land evictions at the end of the day are just a bad business practice. The economic land concessions involved are primarily agriculture. A few of them are involved in plantations. There's a need for labor involved in any economic land concession. As such, we advocate, we've worked with the Cambodian government, the Ministry of Land Management, and the German development agency, GIZ, the development of what is referred to as the leopard skin approach to concessions. This is effectively setting aside space for existing occupants, not relocating them, working around them, and using them or providing them labor and employment opportunities at a livable wage. This has proven very, very successful for Grandis Timber, which I was CEO of for 5 years, and is cited in one of the UN reports on the land grab issue as one of the best practices. With regard to U.S. FCPA issues, we at AmCham advocate this. We hold basically annual seminars on this, which has enjoyed the support of, I believe it was the Treasury Department. And additionally, the Cambodian government is sending senior level officials. In my discussions with officials, they know what the U.S. FCPA is, and they know that I, as a U.S. passport holder, cannot violate that or I run the risk of the penalties. Chinese investment is a very real issue. Chinese investment is not governed by things like the U.S. FCPA. The investors at their institutional level are typically state-owned enterprises, and they do not have the social responsibility or the environmental sustainability criteria that U.S. institutional and European institutional investors mandate. The more money coming in from those two areas in investment, the more competitive we are in implementing programs where we're not asking the government to hold us accountable, but rather our investors themselves are holding us accountable.
Thank you. Let me cut you off there because I want Ms. Schuler to jump in with the short time I have left. If you could turn the mic on.
I would add just that, as Mr. Mitchell mentioned, there are a small handful of investors that perhaps have obligations from outside investments to comply with certain rules, but the fact is that Cambodia's 2001 land law and its sub-decree on economic land concessions already actually provides fairly stringent safeguards which are routinely ignored. There are requirements for size limitations which are ignored, prior environmental and social impact reports, prior consultations and consent from affected communities, transparency, fair and adequate compensation. Those have all been routinely ignored. And these are, we're talking, the vast majority are these large agricultural, industrial land concessions, which also have not only past forced violent evictions, but they have ongoing rights violations, as you mentioned. There's been crackdowns on the demonstrations, arbitrary criminal prosecutions. There's been no offers of compensation or legal remedies to assist the hundreds of families that have continued to suffer as a result of losing their homes or farmland. And I would just want to quickly mention that in May of last year, the government asserted that it addressed many of these issues through a directive suspending new land concessions and mandating a review of existing concessions, and also by the Prime Minister's June launch of an ad hoc land titling program using thousands of student volunteers. And both of the directive and the privately funded titling scheme have been highly problematic. A loophole in the directive allowed for at least 16 new concessions to be granted afterwards, totaling over 80,000 hectares. And Likado is unaware of any systematic review of problematic concessions taking place. And while the push to expedite land titling is laudable in theory, the program completely bypassed established land titling state institutions set up to perform these duties. So the program has been implemented in a secretive manner with no provisions for independent monitoring, with civil society organizations explicitly told to stay away, and numerous credible reports from landholders, especially in indigenous communities, being intimidated or tricked into accepting terms dictated by volunteer students. So such individual titles undermine these indigenous communities' communal land titling efforts.
Okay, thank you very much. My time's expired. I'll recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for their testimony. And I know quite obviously we've got some real good discussions here. Mr. Mitchell, how is it possible for the business community from the United States to survive if this is the kind of atmosphere that the people of Cambodia are facing? What I mean is that we're not just using a pocket knife here, we're using a sledgehammer to really tell the Cambodian government and the people there they don't know what they're doing. They're not leaders because they don't come up to the standards that we Americans expect them to be in forming a democracy. Sometimes I think we have to understand that democracy means to different things to different people and with different regions. If we call ourselves a great democracy, how come we allowed 9 unelected officials to determine the results of a presidential election we had some years ago? How do we justify to the Cambodians that that's a better form of election, of campaign or democracy, when the majority of the people did not determine who should be our next president? So I want to ask Mr. Mitchell, all the presidents of these American companies, I know, we haven't even discussed the garment industry problem, fiasco, with Bangladesh, with India, with Cambodia, with Laos, with Vietnam. What about the consistency or sense of saying, are we doing the same thing? Are we pressing other countries about the violations? We can talk about supply and demand. 85% of small arms sold in Mexico comes from America. And the cartels and the drugs and all that goes in, supply and demand. So what happens is a tremendous demand for clothing and garments to come out of Asia because of cheap labor. Cambodia is one of the prime countries that produces garment, cheap labor. The wages don't even come up to standards with us. How do you reconcile that the major difference, Mr. Mitchell, economically to suggest, American companies are doing very well there? Then when I hear our friends, human rights activists say, things are so terrible there. Hun Sen is a dictator, is a terrible person. And we seem to have forgotten what happened to the killing fields, what these people have had to endure to go through in trying to rebuild this country from ashes. I'm sure that all of you have been to the killing fields, and I'm telling you, Mr. Mitchell, it's not something that I want to share with every American here, what it meant to be to these people. And whether it was Hun Sen or Pol Pot or whatever it is, fact of the matter is Cambodia's history is quite different. I would say 99% of the American people did not know that Cambodia was a colony of the French for some 100 years, along with Laos and Vietnam, before we got involved. And I can tell you, Mr. Mitchell, from what I visited, what I saw, these people were treated like animals. And France is supposed to be the source of enlightenment about democracy and freedom? Give me a break. Mr. Mitchell, could you respond to my question?
I will do my level best to respond without any disagreement to your assessment.
And by the way, I have the utmost respect to my friends here, human rights. I'm a human rights advocate. But sometimes we get the idea, you've got to put it in proper perspective. Let's talk about human rights in the Middle East. Let's talk about human rights in China. Let's not cherry pick. Let's be consistent. If we're going to do this, let's do it with the others too. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I got 1 more minute left.
Were you finished with your response, Mr. Mitchell?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
The United States does not use a consistent yardstick with regard to evaluation of human rights. We don't have the option of critiquing elections in China. We don't have the option of critiquing elections in Laos or in Vietnam, yet we do business with those places. How do U.S. companies survive? Because we set our own standards, and they're higher. And we hold and this isn't just the Americans, the Europeans. And that provides a mechanism for weak institutions that are characteristic of frontier markets, that we, in fact, don't ask what's legal, it's what's right, what are our customers and our investors going to hold us accountable to.
So, Mitchell, I got 6 more seconds. Just want a note of interest. Hun Sen's son graduated from the military academy at West Point. That's where Eisenhower graduated. That's where Nimitz graduated from. That's where MacArthur graduated. Does that make him a bad person? And I understand that his son is one of the most positive results of the kind of advice that is trying to give him to make the country better. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, my time's gone. I wish we'll have the 3rd round already. Thank you.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sifton, you mentioned in your preliminary testimony that cutting foreign and military assistance is a given, and you alluded that you had other suggestions as to how the U.S. could engage the Cambodian government to seek reform. So I'll give you a minute or so to elaborate on that, please.
Thank you. I said it was a given because I think there's an increasing realization in the State Department and the Pentagon and the interagency dialogue that it's time for a new approach to U.S. foreign policy to Cambodia. These are 4 elections, 21 years since the Paris Peace Agreements, and we've had 5 U.S. presidents since Hun Sen took power, 7 U.S. ambassadors. Whatever that attempt has been has not promoted democracy and rights in Cambodia. And so the thinking now is starting to tilt towards a realization that Hun Sen responds, if he ever responds, more to tough talk than to diplomatic talk. Talk all the same, but tough talk in the sense that a warning is put on the table. The money is not so much the issue. IMED is small, FMF is small, but it's symbolically quite potent. The real hurt financially, I think, comes in infrastructure lending from international financial institutions like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, IMF, and others. The World Bank has currently pulled out of Cambodia because of concerns about, well, many things, but it's currently not there. But the U.S. can use its voice and vote on the World Bank, IMF, Asian Development Bank, to vote against large infrastructure lending. We can pull aid, direct assistance to the Cambodian government. One thing that should not be on the table, though, is USAID health programming, PEPFAR funding for HIV/AIDS. Pulling that stuff will not hurt Hun Sen. It won't change anything. It'll just harm ordinary Cambodians.
If you pulled out the lending for infrastructure, I assume that companies like what Mr. Mitchell works with, I mean, they would pull out as well. I mean, that's got to be an attractor to Cambodia that they have access to infrastructure capital.
A quick word about the economics. I mean, the problem, in my opinion, with the ranking chair and Mr. Mitchell's suggestion about the role of economic integration, economic investment, is one of cause and effect. I agree that corporate social responsibility and responsible investment is to the good in every country. But I think it's questionable at best to suggest that these methods will actually promote democracy and human rights. I mean, even if we zoom out and speak in terms of the macroeconomic situation, having a person in power for 30 years, which is what he will be after this election, is ultimately a destabilizing factor in the country's future and will lead to instability, which will lead to serious economic downturns, far more serious than whatever is lost through the loss of investment.
Yeah, you know, one other concern would be, well, first off, China provides infrastructure loans to Cambodia, you know, as well as the other institutions that you talked about. So, you know, if we were to block, you know, the International Monetary Fund, you know, from providing infrastructure loans, do you think it would drive them closer to China? You know, China would step in and provide, you know, whatever loans, infrastructure loans that they needed, and so long term we'd lose any leverage that we might have in Cambodia.
Well, there's 2 responses I'd have to that. One is that I've never quite understood why occupying the space would lead China not to occupy the space or attempt to. And China can make very good offers of its own and will, regardless of how much U.S. investment is put in, first. Secondly, after the experience in Burma, I don't think anybody in the U.S. government really has a problem driving a country into the arms of the Chinese. I don't think the Cambodian government really wants to be in the arms of the Chinese any more than any other government anywhere else in the world. So driving folks to the Chinese to beg hat in hand for infrastructure lending may be in the long-term interest, in the sense that the ruling elite of Cambodia, undemocratic as it is, may realize that, like Burma did, that the future ultimately will be predicated on opening up to the rest of the world and not just depending on handouts from the Chinese government.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, who is also the Subcommittee Chairman on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. It's significant that we should actually be looking at Cambodia after such a long time of ignoring Cambodia. it's interesting that our ignoring Cambodia, after all of these years, Hun Sen is still there. It's time for Hun Sen to go. Hun Sen is a corrupt, vicious human being who has held that country in his grip for decades. It's time for Hun Sen to go. We could talk all we want about theory. Let me ask the panel, is Hun Sen a wealthy man now after these decades, or is he a committed public servant and thus has no outside wealth? Can anyone answer that question for me?
I think it would be difficult to estimate, given the lack of transparency in Cambodia, just how wealthy he and his family are.
Has anyone done any guesstimates as to the wealth of Mr. Hun Sen? All right, let's just suggest that knowing the Cambodian system and knowing his ability to silence the opposition, let's say that he would really take a great deal of integrity for him not to succumb to people who want to give him money in order to do things. Let's go to our businessman over here. Can people do business in China? Excuse me, in China, yes. In this province of China? No. In Cambodia? Maybe all of the above. Can people do business in Cambodia without having to pay bribes and pay off the government?
Absolutely, yes. It requires patience. It takes longer. But absolutely, yes, you can do business in Cambodia.
So remember, you're on the record now.
Yes, I understand
and there's a lot of people around the world are going to say, here's this American businessman who's now saying that Hun Sen is not corrupt when it comes to business investments in his country. And if we
That is not what I'm saying.
Oh, what is it that you said? Excuse
I'm
me.
saying that it is possible to do business
I see.
in Cambodia.
If Hun Sen's out of town for a week and somebody sneaks in, you mean?
No, that is not what I mean.
Okay.
I mean that it is possible to meet the standards of US FCPA and the international standards with regard to avoidance of corruption. It requires patience, but it can be done.
I think that when someone says something can be done, and you're trying to figure out what really someone's saying, is if there's a 1% chance that it can be done, it still can be done, which gives you the...
I did it.
Okay.
I did it with European Pension Fund money behind me. If at any given day they had thought for a moment that I was paying bribes, they would have shut down the project.
All right. Now, let me ask you this. You said it can be done. Just to analyze your words here. It can be done. Does that mean that it is commonplace that people can do business without having to pay off the Hun Sen regime?
For American and Western European companies, yes. Companies from developed markets, yes.
All right. I'm sure that I'm happy you're on the record as saying that. It does stretch my knowledge because you may know, you're on the scene. My information about Hun Sen indicates that that isn't the case, but I will have to admit you're on the scene, and I'm very happy you've made a solid statement on that. Do you know Brett Cerrone, by the way?
Yes, I do.
Okay, sending my best wishes.
I will.
And
I think rest assured Brett's probably watching.
Okay. Let me ask you this, and let us remember, Hun Sen would not be in power, Mr. Chairman, if it wasn't for the cowardice of the United States. Let me just suggest, Hun Sen lost the election that was held after the peace agreement in 1991. He lost the election. There was someone else elected prime minister. We had 10,000 United Nations troops on the ground at that time, and our ambassador decided, well, a compromise would be, we'll let there be 2 prime ministers. No, the compromise was you should have followed what the election was all about and had the person who was elected become the prime minister. So whatever problems we face right now with Cambodia can be traced back to the cowardice of our own government in making sure that we stood tall for democratic principles at a time when we could have enforced that adherence to the democratic process. So now Hun Sen is still there, and it's time for Hun Sen to go. Thank you.
Would the gentleman yield to the ranking member?
I would certainly be happy to yield
the gentleman is given an additional minute to yield to the gentleman.
I just wanted to a little bit to my dear friend from California. Marcos of the Philippines took $8 billion from the Philippine Treasury. Suharto of Indonesia took $8 billion from the Indonesian Treasury. Ho Chi Minh took nothing. He died a simple man. And yet, boy, how we demonized this nationalist leader among the Vietnamese people. And he was the most evil person because he was a communist. He was a socialist. All he wanted to do was to get rid of French colonialism that existed among his people. Hun Sen, that's a good question. I'm gonna help my friend from California find out exactly if he's worth. My impressions, Mr. Chairman, is that if he was so rich, I don't think Cambodia would be in a situation the way it is now. And by the way, U.S. laws do prohibit the kickbacks or briberies of officials when our businesses go overseas to do business. Am I correct in that, Mr. Mitchell?
Absolutely.
Okay, and I think there's been some question, too, about the wealth of members of Congress. How did they get so wealthy since becoming members of this great institution? I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
We will go in a second round now. The chair will recognize himself. First of all, I think as chair of the committee, it's probably my responsibility to comment that Ho Chi Minh was responsible for a tremendous number of deaths and was a pretty dastardly person in many respects. Despite the fact that Saigon is now named after him, at least officially, even though a lot of the people there still call it Saigon. And I want to recognize the gentleman, the ranking member who actually served in Vietnam, wore the uniform of this country and served there, and we certainly respect him greatly for that. I would also note, relative to just a point of reference, the gentleman mentioned the corruption, and I think it certainly is there. In fact, Cambodia is ranked 157th out of 176 countries when it comes to Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index for 2012, so it's ranked pretty darn low. But also, Mr. Mitchell here, the gentleman who's here, I don't want to say defending business necessarily, but giving a business point of view. I would like to think that our American companies around the world, when faced with even corrupt practices in that country, do have a higher standard and follow that. I know Procter & Gamble, for example, is headquartered in my district, and I've had lots of conversations about their dealings all over the world. And they have an absolute policy against that. And if a country isn't cooperative, they'll leave in a heartbeat. And there's a lot of jobs that go with that, and they have high standards. GE Aircraft Engines is also headquartered in my district, and they have those same standards. So I would like to commend our business community for their practices around the world. I wish other companies and other countries always followed that, and they don't always do that. Some do, a lot don't. But I think most American companies do it, and if they don't, they could be prosecuted for it, as we're aware. I've used about half my time in the second round making those statements, but I just thought they needed to be said. As we look at what's happening in Cambodia, the deteriorating human rights situation, the political oppression of opposition parties, and restrictions on freedom of expression, to name just a few, what I'd like to ask the panel is how much leverage does the U.S. still have in Cambodia and with Hun Sen as well? How much of an impact do American administration, say, press releases or pieces of legislation that we pass here in Congress, or hearings like we're holding here today, to the extent that they're covered in that part of the world, or potential action that we might have, cutting foreign aid, has been discussed. Those types of things. What actual power do we have to do some good in that part of the world, and specifically in Cambodia. And I'll go down the line if I can, Mr. Sifton.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I want to emphasize that.
Thank you. My staff wrote it, so I wanted to give it.
I want to emphasize that a very important thing that the State Department and the White House can do is not just what they say and what they do after the election, but what they do with other capitals, what they do in Tokyo, Brussels, and Paris in particular, as well as in Australia and some other countries, in terms of coordinating a coordinated response to what's going on. If Tokyo and Brussels and Paris and London and all the rest of them together make demands about what needs to happen going forward towards the next democratic exercise, if they make credible warnings to Hun Sen about the price of not meeting those standards, he will cave. He has shown himself again and again of a psychological profile where when pushed against the wall, he will deal. He's not a stable, particularly stable leader, but when pushed, he does go back on rationality and doesn't act crazy to the end of the line.
Thank you, Mr. Sifton. Let me go to Mr. Merlot. I'd already asked my first question earlier today to Mr. Mitchell and Ms. Schuler, so I'd like to go to you if I could to wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's really important to distinguish a few different ways the United States can have influence in this circumstance. First, there's the role of the U.S. Embassy and USAID on the ground in Cambodia. And we've already heard from our colleague about the role of the U.S. Ambassador in intervening, the rolling back of the ban on covering Voice of Radio Free Asia and so on within the country. The help that's been given to human rights defenders has been instrumental and been invaluable within Cambodia. There are many things. The role of USAID and giving funding to programs that help promote democracy and human rights and human dignity within Cambodia are instrumental, and those sorts of things should be continued. Second, the role of Congress, the role of the State Department and the White House, as has just been said by my colleague. As you speak up, the world listens, and that brings to bear the whole weight of the international community. I think we have to keep in mind that the new Cambodia was born out of the 1991 Paris Peace Agreements. And the annex to that agreement, that number 4 that applied to the Constitution, calls for democracy, pluralist political competition, and the rule of law. This is not international standards or U.S. standards that are foreign, that are being applied or somehow imposed on Cambodia. These are the things that the Cambodian people have been striving for and risking their lives for, even during the days of Pol Pot and in the 30 years since. It's our role to support them, to come forward, and it's your leading role, and the role of this committee is instrumental in that respect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all the panel members. I'd like to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
We are dealing with a dilemma here in terms of how do we go about enunciating our foreign policy. As it may have been suggested earlier, that we become consistent. If we do it for one, we have to do it for Peter, we should do it for Paul. But when it comes to the realities as far as diplomacy is concerned, issues become gray. They become muddled into it because there are so many other factors to take into consideration. For example, let's talk about the rights of women. Let's talk about the rights of women on a worldwide scale. Oh, but we can't talk about it in Saudi Arabia because we import over $700 billion worth of oil from the Middle East and other countries. So which is more important, human rights of the women or the oil that we need to run our cars? That's where the problem of inconsistency comes in, not because diplomacy is bad, but the reality. It's the reality. We never criticized the Russians for their elections. Oh, we did kind of dabble a little bit on it. But has Putin given in to the pressures from other democracies and saying, hey, Russians, you're not doing a democracy here. What are you doing? Putin is a strong man. He's a dictator, in the opinions of some of our pundits and experts here. I can talk to you about Indonesia. 2.2 million West Papuans. At the point of a barrel of a gun from the Indonesian military under Suharto, you will vote for Indonesia. 1,000 West Papuan chiefs all voted 100% in support of Indonesia's dictatorship. And guess who took a blind eye to this whole thing? Our own U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Why? Because we needed Indonesia because we were fighting the Cold War. We didn't care whether they were dictators or whatever, as long as they were with us. We can also talk about the CIA putting up the Shah of Iran. That's another mess that we created, and there's nothing to do with democracy. So we can, I say this because I love my country, but sometimes we do things. Look what we've done in Iraq, and look at Afghanistan. Look at all these areas. Have we really produced the results that we wanted? Oh no, don't worry about it. Iraq's got all the oil in the world that will pay back the $1 trillion that we fought for some 10 years when we were there in Iraq. $1 trillion. And guess what? 10 major oil companies put up a bid, for the use of the Iraq oil. Guess which company won the bid? The Chinese. And they never lifted a finger to help us fight Saddam Hussein. Anyway, Mr. Chairman, I think my time is up. I'm sorry, I apologize. And my dear brother there, Dana, I know he wants to ask some questions, but I yield back, Mr.
All right,
Chairman.
the gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized to wrap this thing up.
All right, just a couple notes about Ho Chi Minh. Let's just note, he died a simple man, did he? Ho Chi Minh died in a presidential palace. He held power, absolute power, with a terror in North Vietnam, and he sent millions of his people to their death. It resulted in 400,000 Vietnamese were killed in his desire, what? To create a communist state. And guess what? He was the head of it. He was the one who wasn't going to have to worry about elections because he was in power. Now, he was a simple man, all right. And then, of course, what you really have to, by the way, the 400,000 South Vietnamese that were killed, that's after his troops took over South Vietnam. That's not during the process. Not to mention, I think a few people lost their lives in Cambodia due to Mr. Ho Chi Minh and his desires and his maneuvers for power in Southeast Asia. And yes, the United States tried to oppose him, and it was a bridge too far, and we walked away, and people who allied themselves with us were slaughtered. And nowhere was that more evident than in Cambodia. But now back to where Cambodia is today as compared to then. By the way, all those people who died in Cambodia, wasn't there a field commander of Pol Pot named Hun Sen? Am I wrong about that? No. So when we're talking about atrocities in the millions, there's nobody who comes close enough to Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin than Pol Pot. And Hun Sen was his field commander doing his dirty work. And he ended up on top. Why? Because after he lost the election, that was an honest election back in 1991-92, the American ambassador decided, my goodness, Hun Sen will not give up even though he's lost the election, and even though we had plenty of UN troops in there to see that election was recognized. Back to where we are today, in terms of, I'm sorry, I know that Hun Sen's done right by your company and you're protecting the interests of your company, but a lot of people think that it's very corrupt in Cambodia and that there might be a possibility that someone doesn't have to get sucked into it, but it appears by the analysis that actually most people think they are going to get sucked into it if they go there to invest. In that chart that we were just talking about, or the chairman just mentioned, in terms of transparency and accountability, yes, Cambodia comes in 157th out of 172 countries, and countries like Yemen, Angola, Paraguay, Syria, they're all more honest than Cambodia in the analysis of this organization that makes its living by trying to do an honest analysis of what countries are human rights violators or not. Let's put it this way. I think that it's a very important thing that we are drawing attention to Cambodia today. It's important that these arguments get out. I do not blame our business community for trying to get in and make a profit. I do believe what our witness said in his case and in the case of most American companies, because we have made it illegal for them to actually, breaking our law, for them to try to bribe somebody overseas. These other countries don't have that. Now, correct me, am I wrong? Is there a large amount of Chinese investment going in to Cambodia? Am I wrong about that?
You are correct. There is
Okay.
a tremendous amount of Chinese
So
investment.
my guess is that the Chinese who are going in are not going in with the same regulatory burdens that our own companies have in terms of honesty and bribes and paying people off. And what we have seen and what we just heard testimony, Mr. Chairman, is that the people of Cambodia, some people who may have owned land for hundreds of years, are finding that their property is being taken from them. And their property is being stolen from them and often given to foreign investors. And what could be more of an insult to your own people than to be making a profit by selling out your people to foreigners who are there, of course, taking advantage of the fact that you can't have, without freedom of the press, which is very limited there, that they're not going to be exposed. So I appreciate you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my good friend Innie, and let me just note, this is a man who fought for his country. I was in Vietnam in 1967, but I was not in the military. But let me just note that when you said something good about Ho Chi Minh, some people I worked with are dead because of Ho Chi Minh, and they were not bad people. They were very good people. And, yeah, sure, I would yield.
Just
Yes.
for 30 seconds, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say, I wish we had more time so my good friend from California and I could debate Ho Chi Minh and what he stood for. Secondly, we talk about acquisition of lands. There's a saying among the American Indians, yeah, you stole our land, fair and square. I would like to talk about that in terms of what we've done as a country for the last 236, 37 years. It always seems to be, if you don't remember the past, you're condemned to repeat it. I sincerely hope that we'll be fared in the same way that the American Indians have lost their land. What have we done about it? Oh, they're getting spots of it here and there, but I wish it could have been more. But
We let them open up casinos and take our money. What do you mean?
because it's the only means of survival they've got in terms of economic opportunity. All the states continue their lotteries and their bingos and casinos. Oh no, the poor Indians, the Congress have got to see to make sure there's no mafia presence and all the syndicates and all this stuff. No, they run better gaming operations because it's under the auspices of the federal government. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. 14 seconds, Mr.
Thank you
Chairman.
very
Thank
much,
you,
Mr. Chairman.
I thank my friend from California.
But of course,
Thank you. The chair would just note that the U.S. Native American policies are not within the purview of this committee, but I'm sure Congress does have committees that can deal with that issue. We do have India within our jurisdiction, but not American Indians. I would also ask unanimous consent that committee members have 5 days to revise their remarks or submit questions. I want to thank the panel for their testimony. I thought it was excellent testimony by all four. Thank the members of the committee for their spirited involvement here this afternoon. And if there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you.